Okay, so welcome everyone. We're glad that everyone could make it during this busy week. We have some attendees from UAlbany, but also some from the other SUNYs and other regional institutions, so we're happy to see all of you. I've enabled the closed captioning feature, so feel free to turn that on at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you'd like. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kathleen Flynn. I'm one of the science librarians here at the University at Albany, but I'm also on a data services group here on campus, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And we'd like to thank our speakers for being here today. We're joined today by two speakers from the National Institutes of Health to talk about the 2023 Data Management and Sharing Policy. Our speakers are Taunton Paine, the Director of the Scientific Data Sharing Policy Division in the Office of Science Policy, and Cindy Danielson, the Associate Director, Systems Integration in the Office of Research, Reporting, and Analysis. So they'll give a presentation on the policy, and if we have time, I'll just give a brief overview of the resources at UAlbany that can assist researchers with data management and sharing. And then finally, there will be time for a Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Great, thank you so much for having us. I'm going to try to share my screen here. All right, can you see that? Great.
Yes.
Great. All right, well, thanks for having us. And thanks for that introduction. I think the plan for this presentation is that we'll go over some issues related to the data management and sharing policy, including kind of where it came from, generally speaking, what it expects. We'll go over some of the related guidance around it, and we'll talk about some of the implementation activities and the resources that have been coming online in the last 2 years or so. So first off, why does NIH want to share scientific data? Why do we have this policy? I think there are two really main reasons that are emphasized in the data management and sharing policy that was issued in October 2020. And that is that first off, NIH wants to advance the rigor and the reproducibility of the research that we support. Sharing data helps to enable validation of research results. It also helps to make high-value data sets accessible when there may have been substantial taxpayer investment in them. Making data available helps to accelerate future research directions, and it creates opportunities for different teams to actually collaborate and to cite each other's work. In addition to these scientific reasons, though, I think there's also important public policy goals represented in this policy, which includes that we really want to promote the public trust in the research that we support. So sharing data helps to foster transparency and accountability and demonstrates good stewardship over taxpayer funds. It also presents an opportunity to maximize research participant contribution to the research that they support with their time and their effort. And it provides an opportunity to sort of reaffirm appropriate protections for research participants' data. But I don't want to give you the impression that this is the first data sharing policy that NIH has issued. We've had data sharing policies in some form that I'm aware of going back to at least 1989 at the agency. I think the first really sort of big data sharing policy was in 2003 with the NIH data sharing policy that focused on large awards of $500,000 per year or more, which generally would require that they submit a data sharing plan sort of describing how they would plan to share data or why sharing was not possible. That policy is fairly similar to the one that we're talking about today, but the one that we're talking about today does not have a $500,000 threshold, and it's much more sort of detailed in the guidance that it provides. The next kind of major step was in 2007 with the Genome-wide Association Studies policy, later expanded into the 2014 Genomic Data Sharing Policy, which basically expects the sharing of large-scale human and non-human genomic data through typically publicly available data repositories. It sets in place some additional expectations around features such as informed consent and governs the actual controlled access to sort of human data as well. I do want to point out that that policy is not actually going away with the implementation of this policy, so they will continue to coexist and have sort of complementary expectations. Another policy that I think people might be aware of is the policies that we have for the dissemination of clinical trial information. So this is one we've had since 2016 that expects all NIH-funded investigators running clinical trials to register their clinical trials in clinicaltrials.gov and to submit summary results information there. But despite this history of data sharing policies, we're aware that there is a growing literature demonstrating poor accessibility of data underlying publications. So just taking 3 examples from the last year and a half. From last year, one paper looked at 875 papers across 9 disciplines, including many in the life sciences, published over about the last 20 years. They tried to obtain data from those papers and were only able to do so about 40% of the time. And 20% of the time, their requests were just outright declined. And for all sorts of reasons like, the PI has died, or we can't find the data, or we don't trust the requesters. There was another sort of high profile effort, of which this was only one of a series of papers in late 2021, attempting to repeat 193 experiments from 53 high impact cancer biology papers. And they weren't able to obtain the data from about 68% of those experiments. And then in the most recent example, which did get some sort of publication in the media, authors looking at 1,700 or almost 1,800 papers published in January 2019 that actually had data availability statements were only able to obtain the data from about 6.8% of those papers. So we can obviously do better than this. And I think the public expects us to. And it's telling that there's a survey from 2019 by Pew looking at US adults and asking them to rank the factors that would cause them to trust scientific research findings more. And the number 1 factor that they've ranked is that data would be openly available to the public. So to help address some of these issues and to respond to a growing number of mandates from the last 3 White House administrations and Congress, NIH started an effort in 2016 with an RFI where we did a sort of iterative process of actually consulting with the research community and the public about a data management and sharing policy. So we issued an RFI in 2016, an RFI in 2018, and used the feedback on those to inform a draft of the policy that was published in 2019 for public comment. At the same time, we started a formal tribal consultation on the policy, as well as got input from the Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections, and we discussed with other departments and agencies through the Subcommittee on Open Science under the National Science and Technology Council. All told, we received about 200 public comments on the draft policy, and all of this feedback was used to revise the draft policy into a final policy that was published in October 2020. And we understood that there was a need for time to make people understand the expectations of the policy and give time for compliance. And so that policy isn't taking effect until January 25th, 2023. So we've had a little over 2 years to understand the policy. So I want to switch now to talking about sort of what the policy expects. So the policy is pretty straightforward in that it has 2 basic requirements. And those requirements are the submission of a data management and sharing plan for all NIH-funded research. So that's grants, contracts, cooperative agreements, other transaction awards, and the intramural research program. And that these plans would generally describe how, where, and when scientific data will be shared. It also requires compliance with the version of the plan approved by the institute, center, or office that is funding the research. And we do say in the policy that compliance with those plans can affect future funding decisions. It will become effective on January 25th, 2023 for new and competing awards that are submitted for that receipt date and later dates, at which point it will replace the 2003 data sharing policy for those awards going forward. So to give you a sense of the kinds of activities that this will apply to, so it generally speaking applies to all research that generates scientific data, So that will generally include research projects. It does apply to SBIR and STTR awards, but there is some additional consideration there, and to things like research centers. It will generally not apply to research projects that do not generate scientific data or non-research projects, which includes things like training and fellowship awards or things like construction or research-related infrastructure projects. In terms of the details of the policy, so for the scope, it really applies to NIH-supported research that generates scientific data. And scientific data are specifically defined in the policy as the recorded factual material of sufficient quality to validate and replicate the research findings, regardless of whether the data are necessarily used to support scholarly publications or not. So it relates to the proposed research questions, and the findings can include things like unpublished null results. What's not included in this definition, and so what would not be expected to be shared, are things like laboratory notebooks or preliminary analyses, things like completed case report forms from clinical trials, or any kind of physical objects. So laboratory specimens would not be expected to be shared under this policy. The timelines come in sort of two different categories. So first off, in terms of when data should be shared, the policy would expect that data underlying peer-reviewed journal articles would be shared at the time of the publication of that article. And data underlying anything else would be shared by the end of the period of performance. And that includes things like preprints would be shared by the end of the period of performance. In terms of how long to share scientific data once it has been made available, the policy doesn't provide a specific timeline for that. It doesn't say, for example, you should propose 10 years. What it does is it says that you should consider other relevant requirements that may apply to you from other sources. So for example, journal policies, or repository policies, or sometimes even things like record retention requirements as the minimum time frame for how long you should propose to make data available for. So I mentioned earlier that the policy really has only two requirements. It requires the submission of a plan, and it requires adherence to that plan. It does not directly require data sharing, but it does expect that in developing plans, applicants will maximize appropriate data sharing, recognizing that in order for sharing to be appropriate, there are certain justifiable limitations that we have to recognize. And in general, the policy emphasizes that all data should be managed, but not all data must or can be shared. And all data sharing really should be responsibly implemented, and plans should outline how the privacy, the rights, and the confidentiality of research participants will be protected. And of course, researchers must continue to abide by existing laws, regulations, and policies. So nothing in this policy would change any expectations to follow, for example, the Common Rule or the HIPAA privacy rule if those applied to your research. I also want to point out that other NIH policies may continue to apply. So I mentioned earlier that the NIH GDS policy will continue to exist. And in those cases, that sets sort of additional expectations that are more stringent than the ones in this policy, and those would have to be followed too. In general, I think what we're trying to achieve with this is to ensure that data sharing is prospectively planned for, and that it is factored into all stages of the research process. So in order for sharing to be appropriate, there are obviously certain limitations that have to be recognized, and the policy specifically references that there can be ethical, legal, or technical factors that may necessitate some limitations on sharing data. We've elaborated through a frequently asked question that these include things like when there is informed consent that would not permit or would limit the scope of sharing or use, if the privacy or safety of research participants would be compromised and available protections like certificates of confidentiality would be insufficient to protect them. If there are, of course, explicit federal, state, local, or tribal laws, regulations, or policies that would prohibit disclosure, those must be followed. If there are any kind of restrictions imposed by existing or anticipated agreements with third parties, so for example, if you had to enter into a data use agreement in order to get access to data to do your research in the first place that would impose restrictions on your ability to share subsequent results, that is something that could potentially also be a justifiable limitation. And we've recognized that in some cases, it simply may not be practical to digitize, certain information, with sort of reasonable efforts. There's a couple of factors that we've indicated are generally not justifiable reasons to limit sharing alone. So for example, saying that the data are considered to be too small, that researchers anticipate data will not be widely used, or that they're not thought to have a suitable repository. There's a couple of additional considerations I want to emphasize as well. So I mentioned earlier that NIH undertook a tribal consultation on this policy specifically. NIH respects tribal sovereignty and supports responsible management and sharing of Alaska Native or American Indian and Alaska Native participant data. And so we actually issued a supplemental information related to developing a data management and sharing plan when working with tribes, intended to actually indicate sort of what's appropriate in this space. And then we also have certain expectations related to SBIR and STTR awardees stemming from the SBIR STTR program policy directive, in recognition of the fact that they do have authority to withhold certain kinds of data for certain amounts of time. So alongside the policy, we also published a supplemental information about sort of the recommended elements of a data management and sharing plan to help people understand sort of what we're looking for here. So these include, that there would be sort of a section for a data type that would generally describe, the types of data that will be shared, related tools, software, and code. This is not an expectation to share software or code, but rather an expectation to disclose if there are certain kinds of tools, software, or code that would be necessary to access and to manipulate the data. I do want to point out, just as a side note, that NIH has issued sort of FAQs related to best practices for sharing tool, software, and code if you are doing that. But again, that's not a requirement of this policy. There's a section for standards to sort of indicate what standards will be used for the data and the metadata that would be shared. There's also a section for data preservation, access, and timelines. So this is where you would indicate what repository would be used and how long the data would be made available for. And there's a section for access, distribution, and reuse considerations. And this is where you would describe any of those kind of limitations that I was just describing earlier. And last, there's an element for oversight of data management, which is really to sort of indicate who at an institution will be responsible for monitoring and sort of managing plan compliance. And we have not stated that this has to be any specific individual at the institution. So to help people sort of work through, developing a plan, we've issued a sort of draft format page for a data management and sharing plan that, basically incorporates those standard recommended elements. It's optional. It's not a requirement to use it. It will be finalized later this year. And I do just want to, point out that this is what we're planning for now, but we do actually have a pilot project right now with the Federal Demonstration Partnership to really, work through a couple of different options related to sort of structured templates and tools that might, provide a little more substance in terms of being able to develop a data management and sharing plan to help the research community. This is something we'll be working towards in the future. So in addition to that supplemental information about recommended elements of a plan, we also issued one about sort of how to identify an appropriate data repository, because the data management and sharing policy really prioritizes sharing of data through established repositories. We actually developed this working through the Subcommittee on Open Science in the National Science and Technology Council with other departments and agencies. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy up in the White House just recently sort of issued this on kind of a federal basis. It includes a number of sort of desirable characteristics for repositories that I won't go through now. It does differentiate between sort of general repositories and ones that are specifically for the sharing of human data. The policy does not require the use of any particular data repository, but rather sort of leaves it up to applicants to figure that out. But I do want to indicate that there may be policies, for example, coming from NIH institutes and centers that they want their awardees to use specific repositories. So, for example, some awards from NIMH will generally be directed to use the NDA, and applications that are under the GDS policy may be directed to use a subset of existing repositories. To help people sort of prioritize which kinds of repositories to use, the supplemental information also indicates that we'd like them to think first about using data type and discipline specific data repositories. And to help in that determination, we've provided a non-comprehensive list of just NIH supported data repositories on a website that we'll describe in more detail later. It includes some information about them, and here's some of the examples of ones that actually appear there. Again, it's not a requirement to use these, and this is just sort of to help people get started in thinking about what kind of repository they might use. If there are no appropriate repositories that are discipline or data type specific, it would certainly be acceptable to use something like an institutional repository, and we're certainly aware that a number of institutions are or have different kinds of repositories available to their investigators. We've also indicated that in some cases, sharing small data sets through PubMed Central within a company publication may be appropriate. But we've also been working with the generalist data repositories. So these are kinds of repositories that are sort of not data type or discipline specific. They're generally run by third parties, and they're meant to really accommodate a large number of different types of data from different research sources. So we've had a small effort going with them to help them kind of be or have practices that are sort of more in line with the FAIR principles and with the policy. I do just want to point out that there was a webinar series to help sort of connect researchers with generalist repositories that was hosted from September to December. Those are all available online, and you can see the sort of archived versions of those. One of the other sort of comments that we heard a lot during the policy development period that we've tried to address through additional supplemental information is how to appropriately protect privacy when sharing human research participant data. So we issued over the summer a new supplemental information that really addresses how to do this by providing kind of a basic framework for researchers to consider as they're developing their plans. It's not intended as a guide for regulatory compliance, so the common rule and a HIPAA still have to be followed. It is intended to be sort of applicable in different research contexts, and it does this by sort of establishing shared principles, providing what we consider to be best practices for sharing of data in this way, and offers certain considerations for determining whether human data should be controlled or doesn't need to be. So just to sort of zero in on the best practices in that document, it really lays out 3 different things that should be implemented together. So the first is that we really recommend de-identifying to the greatest extent possible all human data while maintaining scientific utility. And this means using both the common rule and HIPAA privacy rule standards for de-identification. But in addition to that, we do ask people to consider the risks of sharing the information even when it is de-identified. And we ask that they consider sharing identifiable data only with the explicit consent of research participants. We also think that it's important to use agreements to cover the transfer of data, and that these agreements should generally communicate any kind of limitations on use that might be present, for example, stemming from the informed consent, and should include certain things like prohibitions on re-identification or recontact of research participants. And last, it's important to understand the sort of applicable, legal protections and limitations on disclosure that might exist. And this includes understanding, what the applicability of NIH, certificates of confidentiality would be to this situation. In addition, earlier this year, we also published a resource to help people think about how to incorporate language regarding the future use and sharing of data and biospecimens in their informed consent. This is a voluntary document. It's intended to provide sort of sample language that can be modified and certain considerations for people to think through. Again, it's not a requirement, but it's just simply meant to be helpful so that people can start working through this. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Cindy.
Thanks, Taunton. So moving on to another topic, costs. So NIH does acknowledge that some of these activities may carry with them costs, and the policy recognizes that and allows for reasonable costs to support these activities described in a data management and sharing plan to be included in budget requests. Any of these costs, they must be incurred during the performance period for the award, and types of activities that for which you may consider requesting funding could include curating data, developing supporting documentation, preserving and sharing data through repositories, as well as local data management considerations, getting those data ready for sharing. There are other types of costs that are related to data sharing, but that NIH does not consider direct data sharing costs. And that would include infrastructure costs that are typically included in your indirect costs already. So if some cost is being used across projects across your institution, that would not be appropriate to request project-specific direct costs for the same activity. Also, there are other types of costs that are just considered part of the routine conduct of research, for example, getting access to others' research data. And so that would not go into your data management and sharing budget. And over time, once this policy goes into effect and we begin receiving these budget requests along with the plans, NIH does hope to learn more about what constitutes reasonable costs for different types of activities related to data management and sharing. And we have included links in the slide set. We will share these, and they point you to specific parts of the website to get more information about the various information we've put out in the policy itself and supplemental information notices as well. Next slide, please. So here's just an overview of how data management and sharing plans will be submitted and reviewed. And I will note this is specific to extramural grant awards. The policy does apply to other types of funding, including contracts and other transactions, as well as the intramural research program, research done at NIH itself. But these details are specific to grant awards, and these other types of funding activities, they'll have analogous requirements put in place. So for grants, the plan will be submitted with the funding application. There will be a brief plan description as part of the budget justification, so that information is available for peer reviewers to consider. And then the full plan that is expected to cover those elements that Taunton talked through earlier, that will be a separate attachment elsewhere in the application. We have put out updated instructions for the grant application forms to include a new field where this will be attached, and that information is available now. Then after the plan is submitted as part of the funding application, let's talk about how that will be assessed. Peer reviewers are able to comment on the budget for that data management and sharing, the costs to support the activities. This is not going to be scored, but they may comment on whether that budget appears to be reasonable. But it's NIH program staff who will be responsible for assessing the plans themselves. And so the program staff will look at the plans and determine if those are complete enough to assess and if they are acceptable from the funding ICO's perspective. And if there are any issues with approving that plan that was provided in the application, plans can be revised. So if the plan is not perfect the first time, there will be some back and forth opportunity where if there are any issues or information that is needed, that can hopefully be addressed before an award is made. So then when the plan has been approved and an award is made, that approved DMS plan will be incorporated as a term and condition of the award. And then compliance with the activities that were described in that plan will be monitored at regular reporting intervals. I'll talk about compliance on a later slide, but generally annual reporting. And compliance may factor into future funding decisions. The policy did note that. So we do intend for institutions to really take these seriously and follow through with them. Next slide, please. So in terms of compliance, as I just mentioned, the approved DMS plan will become a term and condition of award, and recipients will report the progress on implementing the activities described in their approved DMS plan in their Research Performance Progress Report, or RPPR. So in those annual RPPRs, there will be updates made where you can report progress on, again, the activities that you've outlined in your plan. And then NIH staff will review that compliance annually. If there are any issues, of course, NIH wants to work with the recipients to try and make sure that they are able to remain in compliance. But depending on exactly what case something might look like, failure to comply could result in an enforcement action if necessary. That could include additional special terms and conditions or a termination of award, and may also affect future funding decisions. But again, the hope is that NIH would work with any recipients who are having issues meeting any milestones described in their plan, so that that does not happen. The policy itself did leave open the possibility that we might make DMS plans publicly available. No decisions have been made on when that might be and where that would be located, but that is a possibility. So just as a reminder, when you are writing plans, there's a potential in the future that we might make those available to the public. Next slide, please. So in these coming slides, I want to point out a few resources on where you can go for more information. We have consolidated all information related to sharing policies on a single website. You can access that at sharing.nih.gov, and this is NIH's scientific data sharing website. It, of course, covers the data management and sharing policy, which we're here to talk about today, but also covers other policies, such as the genomic data sharing policy and other sharing policies, such as model organisms and research tools. So that header up at the top, you can navigate between policies and find different information related to these different topics. This is, of course, a living website, and content will be updated over time. So as NIH puts out guidance and clarification and any relevant resources, we will integrate that into the website here, make sure it really can act as a one-stop shop. Next slide, please. So I'll just highlight a few categories of information we have here. One relates to planning and budgeting. And so there's information about writing a data management and sharing plan in terms of what you might consider including in there, for example. Budgeting as well, the different types of activities that NIH has outlined as potentially being allowable costs, depending on the scope of your proposal. And I should have updated this because we have in fact updated this now that we have the instructions out there for the new grant application forms. Next slide, please. So resources for sharing scientific data. There's some content here about data sharing approaches and some resources related to selecting data repositories, giving you some options to consider when you're considering where you might share your data. Next slide, please. So resources for understanding sharing policies. And this lets you explore NIH's different sharing policies. And if you're curious for a particular project, whether one or more sharing policies might apply, we have resources here to help you understand the scope of each one. And in the next slide, I think we have a snapshot of a tool to help you find which policies apply to you. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here we go. So it's just a few questions where it asks you about your research, what outputs you expect to generate, and will help guide you to understand which policies might apply to your research so you can prepare for that in your application. Next slide, please. And now I will turn it back over to Taunton to talk about more that will come in the next month and a half or so.
Great, thanks. Well, so at the beginning of the year, we issued a blog laying out kind of a general roadmap for things that we'd be issuing over the course of this year and thinking about 2023 and beyond. So what we've made available over the last year, in addition to the things that Cindy was just mentioning, are a sort of NIH webinar series. This is a sort of two-part series that we hosted over the summer. It was pretty well attended. A lot of the content that we discussed there, we discussed here today, but it still potentially has other sort of useful things in it, and it had kind of a live Q&A session that may also be helpful. Those are archived on that sharing.nih.gov website that we just walked through. We had a number of FAQs we've issued. I think we've done something like 25 or so. Those can be found from a couple of different points on the sharing.nih.gov website. There are actually also FAQs for the other policies there as well, so it's important to make sure you're looking at the one for the right policy. We also have two supplemental information documents. I mentioned both of these earlier, one about when working with sort of tribal data and one when thinking about how to protect research participant privacy that were issued over the summer as well. And we did cover those in the second webinar that I just mentioned. Additionally, I stated a couple of times that the GDS policy would be staying, in effect, and would also apply to certain awards as well. That policy expects researchers to submit a genomic data sharing plan that was very similar to the data management and sharing plan. And we decided that it would not actually be helpful for people to submit two data sharing plans in those cases that describe mostly the same thing. So we basically did away with the GDS policy plan and have all sort of expectations for reporting, sharing of genomic data are now going to be sort of integrated into the data management and sharing plan going forward from January when this policy takes effect. Before 2023, you can expect that we will finalize the plan format page that I described earlier. There are a couple of additional FAQs that we're working on that we're planning to provide. We'll be continuing to update those, over time as we get more questions from people. So this is something that's really helpful for us to hear. And then, beyond 2023, we really want to undertake, an assessment of the policy, to sort of understand whether we're meeting our goals, both in terms of kind of compliance in the short term, but also longer term, sort of, whether we're actually, kind of affecting the cultural change that we want to see. And then I think something else that we hear from time to time is, concern that, the incentive structure doesn't always, align with wanting to share data. And so this is something that we're thinking about as well. I think, NIH is not the only player in this space that probably has work to do here. But this is something that we'd like to consider, kind of what options we have in the future too. So we'll be thinking about that in 2023 and beyond. Just as an example of some of the FAQs we've issued, so these are some of the topics that we've covered there, and if you're interested, you can go to the sharing.nih.gov and read more on these. I have heard that these are quite helpful. And just some more background on the webinar. So again, those are both available through sharing.nih.gov. And I want to sort of end on one additional point, which is something that you may have heard about through the news, which was that on August 25th, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued a public access memo that really directs federal agencies, so that includes us, that actually support research to develop plans to ensure that publications that result from federally funded research are made freely available with no embargo. That scientific data underlying publications are made accessible at the time of publication, and to think about approaches for sharing scientific data that do not underlie publication. And then on a longer term time frame, to think about sort of the collection and sharing of appropriate metadata from publications and data, and for the use of things like persistent identifiers for publications, data, researchers, awards, and other kinds of objects. So NIH is in the process of developing our plan to respond to this memo, and we will be seeking public input on it when it's final early next year. One thing that I do want to say is that in general, as was stated by Dr. Tabak in his statement on this, we do generally see the policy that we've just been describing today as being consistent with this memo, and so I would not anticipate any changes to what we've just described. So here's a number of sort of resources, some of which we've already gone over, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I will just quickly, I'd like to just quickly go over where you can find assistance with these topics on campus. So we have a data services group here on campus, and that is comprised of members from the university libraries, ITS, the Data Management and Analytics Center, or DMAC, the Division for Research, the Office of General Counsel, and others. And we have a data services page, which I'll show you in a second. But just quickly, where to find help. The library can help you if you need to locate secondary data sets, or if you need help with selecting which data to preserve or how to do that. Same with data sharing, the when, where, how about doing that. DMAC can provide consultations for data collection, documentation, ethical considerations. So especially if you need to de-identify your data, if you have sensitive data and you are thinking about sharing it and you're able to. And then ITS, they can provide technical controls for data privacy and security standards, storage and backup, computing resources, etc. Be sure to contact sponsored programs if you have questions about data sharing requirements. For instance, if you need a data use agreement, and of course, contact IRB with questions about human subjects data, and IACUC with questions about animal use data. And then I also wanted to point out another great resource is DMP Tool. And this is a free and collaborative tool. It helps researchers create data management plans. And it does this by providing templates from the major funding agencies. And those templates will have instructions and guidance. The template for the new NIH 2023 policy has some example answers that they've created, which I'll show you briefly. And you can also share your plan that you create there publicly. So there is also, here's an example of a plan that won a challenge recently, and it used the new NIH 2023 template. And then finally, UAlbany is affiliated with DMP Tool. And what this means is you can log into it using your UAlbany credentials. If your institution isn't affiliated, you just create a free account. But you can see UAlbany specific guidance, which I'll show you in a second. So this is the data services page. And if you're on the library page, you can find it by going up to services and then scholarly communication services. But the first thing you'll notice is we have a new monthly newsletter, and this provides brief tips about data management, such as storage, informed consent, etc. And then we have sections with information and resources about each aspect of data management. So you can find things about finding data and creating data management plans. You'll also see here with ITS, it's linking to the data classification standards. There's information about creating metadata or README guides. Here, information about storage on campus and security and who to contact, and then about where to possibly share your data. And you see here, one of the links included is Scholars Archive. If you don't know, this is the institution's repository, and it can house your publications as well as data. So that's an option. And then we have other information here from each of the members that are in the data services group, and other workshops or tutorials. We have FAQs, and then links for who to contact. And then another thing that you may have seen when you registered is, and we do link to it here, we have a guide about this new policy, and that also includes a lot of the links that Taunton was just sharing. So that's another thing to check if you need help finding those links. And then I just quickly wanted to show you DMP Tool. So you'd go here, the links are on the data services page, but otherwise it's dmptool.org. And to sign in, if you're affiliated with UAlbany, you just enter your email address, and then it will check to see how you can sign up. So because we're affiliated, you would just sign in with your UAlbany credentials. And then you'll see here we have some links at the top to the data services page I just showed, ITS, DMAC, the Division for Research. There is an email address here, and you can use that to contact the data services group. You can also ask for somebody to briefly look at your data management plan. And you can see the funder requirements up here if you want to look at them separately. There are some publicly shared plans here, and some of them have been marked as featured, so they've been reviewed and they're good to look at and use as, to see an example. You can create a plan, but I'm just going to briefly show you. This is a template. It uses the new NIH 2023 template. So you'd add details about your project. This is where you would select what guidance you want to see. So by default here, you'll see guidance from DMP Tool. If you're affiliated with UAlbany, or if your institution is affiliated, you'll see their guidance, but you can select guidance from other institutions if you'd like and save that. You can add some collaborators. So this is a nice way. You can set their permissions, whether you want that to be read and comment only, or if you'd like them to be able to edit. And then when you write the plan, so you see here, you remember Taunton showed you the questions, the sections for this plan. So here are the questions, and here's where you could enter in your answers. You see guidance over here on the right. This is from NIH. This is from DMP tool. And then you'd see here guidance from Albany or any other institutions you've selected. And you can add comments here. And this template happens to have some example answers, which can be useful, but remember your situation might mean that this isn't perfect for you, so be aware of that. And then when you're ready to download, you can select what format you'd like and select if you'd like this to be public or private. And that's DMP tool. So with that, we can move to Q&A. So feel free to ask a question in chat or use the raise hand feature and unmute yourself. If we are recording, so if you'd like to ask a question anonymously, feel free to send the question to me privately and I can ask that. So do we have any questions? Emily.
Hi, thank you. First, thank you for coming and speaking with us. We really appreciate it. I was wondering, so at the end, Kathleen was showing us DMP tool, and I know, Taunton, you mentioned that NIH might be developing sort of their own guidance or templates for creating a data management plan that aligns with NIH's requirements. Could you, would a plan from DMP tool, do you foresee that sort of being less preferable, or, could you speak about that a little bit?
Well, I might turn this to my colleague Cindy to see if she has thoughts on this first.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to respond to this one. So right now, we are leaving the flexibility out there because we know just how different each project can be and how different each plan might need to be. So we have not mandated the use of a particular template or set up anything structured because we want to make sure that we're learning from experience here and everyone's able to develop a plan that makes sense for them. With that said, we are looking forward to in the future, we might be able to have a more standard template. And so we've recently kicked off an effort with the Federal Demonstration Partnership, or the FDP, to partner with the recipient community and leverage that group to help pilot test different templates, maybe 1 or 2 templates. We're still kind of planning for that pilot and what exactly we'll get out there. But the plan is that for approximately the first year or so of policy implementation, we'll have maybe 1 or 2 templates out there that will be tested through FDP member institutions as part of this pilot. Then we can learn from that experience how effective are those templates from the recipient perspective of preparing those plans, and also at giving NIH the information it needs to help streamline the assessment process and then monitor for compliance moving forward. And so that's kind of the, at a high level, what we're looking to moving forward. You also asked whether DMP tool, would meet the mark. And right now, the only requirement is that you attach a flattened PDF to the grant application, because that's just what the system requires. So if you use the DMP tool to prepare that, that is perfectly acceptable. There are some, I guess one other requirement, please don't include hyperlinks in your plans. NIH has a hyperlink policy. We don't like to see those in applications for various reasons. But yeah, if you use the DMP tool and attach that to your application, if that works for your project, there is not a problem with that. We're open to whatever works best for you preparing those plans. Taunton, did you have anything to add?
No, yeah, I'll just say I think it's still, the future is still pretty open in terms of, I think there's a lot to learn, from what we get from the first year of applications.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I see a question in chat here about that NIH template in DMP tool. I believe that was created by the DMP tool staff themselves. So you should, if you have, and everybody should have access to DMP tool since it's free. So you should have access to that template with the example answers. And let me know if you don't, because I think you should. Yep, Emily.
Thanks. I have one more question. I know that you talked about data use agreements briefly, and I was wondering, do you foresee developing any sort of recommended language related to data sharing and human participants and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the place where we probably talk about this in the most detail is in the supplemental information for protecting research participant privacy. So I would take a look at that. There's a couple of kind of references in there. One of the things we said in there, we provided a reference to the fact that there are sources out there now where people have kind of compiled some of these agreements. So for example, FDP again is actually a group that has put together a set of data use agreements. They may not be applicable in all cases here because they do predate the policy, but it's probably one of the best existing sources out there. We did also say in that supplemental information that we would consider making sort of templates available for people for things like data submission and data use agreements.
Thank you.
I was wondering, if a researcher is collaborating with researchers who are not in the U.S., what should they do with their plan?
So I'm happy to start this and turn it over to Cindy for anything else she might want to add. So, in general, I think the expectations would be the same as for anyone else. We would generally expect that people would, follow applicable laws, regulations, and policies, that do apply to them. So, in some cases, we're certainly aware that there may be, restrictions imposed by other countries. Those are the kinds of things that I think should be described in plans and should be sort of disclosed, and submitted there. So we understand that there can certainly be, certain limitations in those cases as well.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Hi, thank you for this informative presentation. I wanted to go back to a question about the data use agreement. So I'm a faculty member and I'm working with a data use agreement with the health and retirement study, which kind of uses, part of it is on an enclave, part of it is public use data that gets merged. I'm just wondering what the expectations are with that kind of data arrangement. Are we supposed to, in the data management plan, kind of talk about like the public use data in the data management plan, or do we consider the whole thing kind of classified as, in the situation of a data use agreement, because the full research cannot be executed without the kind of confidential data. So it's a little more complicated.
Yeah, and so actually, there's an aspect I didn't get into detail here about, which is sort of about how the policy applies to secondary research. So when you are accessing data, for example, in a repository, analyzing it, and then publishing findings based on that, we've generally clarified we do not expect people to share data that have already been shared or to propose sharing that kind of thing. So there's no expectation to do that. And certainly this is the case in other kinds of repositories like CMS repositories, where there are very strong prohibitions on sharing data. We also recognize, though, that even though we're not necessarily expecting people to do anything with respect to primary data that exists in an existing repository, you can still have things like derived data sets that may constitute the scientific data that we would, generally speaking, under the policy, expect to be addressed in your data management and sharing plan. But in some cases, agreements to access the primary data to generate those data may impose restrictions on your ability to redisclose that kind of thing. And so, we've certainly acknowledged that in the policy. And that's the kind of thing that, it's a type of limitation that we would expect to be included in, data management and sharing plans. I can give you a really specific example, which is in the database of genotypes and phenotypes that NIH maintains. Many people use this repository, thousands of people per year. And when they access the data, they often will generate a new data set, or they will, analyze it. But we have, as part of the terms of access and use of that data set, a prohibition on redisclosure, and that includes certain types of derived data from the repository. So that's the kind of limitation that you would have to describe in a data management sharing plan.
Thank you.
Erin, your hand is up.
So related, just continuing on with this line of discussion, is there a checklist or because I'm thinking both not only for faculty, but for research administrators for the RAs in particular, I think it would be a lot to expect them to understand all these nuances. So have you developed a checklist for the different resource sites that they could look at, or a flow chart to better be able to define when a DMP is needed for a submission? Or should we work on that? I guess is what we should add that to our to-do list.
So we don't have something as detailed as I think a checklist. Certainly, if you go to the sharing.nih.gov website, it does kind of list things out in sort of a way that I think makes sense with respect to data management and sharing plans, which is probably, it's the filling out of a plan that will probably prompt a lot of the considerations. I would also, really sort of again, direct you to the frequently asked questions, are where I think a lot of the sort of nuance that you're describing has been addressed. So things like like what are the appropriate limitations for plans? That's addressed there. Points about what's the applicability to secondary research? That's addressed there. So I think those are really important places to look.
So we can work out. We have a lot of secondary data projects here, and I'm anticipating if we give the rule to the RAs, they need to look for a DMP, and then there are exceptions to that. We'll need to provide some guidance. So thank you. That's very helpful.
Samantha?
Yeah, I just have one follow-up question along this line of questioning, which is, given that this DMP part is not factored into the scoring of the application, if there's some questions about it, would that undermine the ability to get the funding if you score well and there's some questions or not, maybe it's not perfectly clear on some aspects, like a more complicated situation? How will that be handled? Will the program officer get in touch with the applicant, or it'll just assume, oh, it's not clear, therefore we're not giving funding?
Great question. And no, it's the former. The program officer will absolutely get in touch with the applicant if there are any issues with the plan that was submitted. If there's, some information that they just need to clarify to understand whether it's acceptable or not, or if there's any issues that, would require some discussion. The goal is to get the plan suitable to approve. That's really what we want to happen. We don't want to be turning things down. So that is the goal. This will be new. There will probably be some back and forth initially. This will happen as part of the standard just-in-time process after the initial review, but before any award is made. And yeah, the goal is to get that plan ready so that there's no issues.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I don't see any. So I suppose we can end here. So thank you everyone for attending. I'll be in contact regarding sharing the recording and the slides. And thanks again to our speakers.
Thanks very much for having us.